Welcome to part 8 of Across the Unknown, Sex After Death and the Secret of Success. Includes new definitions of the words spiritual and imagination, the differences and similarities between occultists, psychics, and followers of traditional religions, and how to deal with nuisances and fanatics. What you can take with you, how the dead communicate with the living, and a new way to escape the vortex. New definitions of imagination and spiritual. If life after death is a fact, wouldn't our favorite activities somehow unconsciously reflect it? Wouldn't we symbolize the truth over and over again, remembering but not recognizing that we're remembering? Consider the symbolism every time we get in a car. The inhabiting consciousness enters the rigid vehicle, inert without the driver, that makes possible an extended journey through the material world. A car can be an identity, but no car lasts a lifetime, so there's a trade-in. We play video games where we become alternate personalities that learn level to level, then die. Our heroes are actors who, like symbolic reincarnating spirits, inhabit successive leading roles, or athletes who perform feats of speed, strength, and agility that seem to defy the laws of physics. Social media profiles seldom reflect the reality of meeting in person, since many of us use our online personas to act out aspects of our personalities, trying out other ways of being. Some of us have lived multiple digital incarnations. We love to sit at home or in movie theaters, becoming absorbed by the lives of others, as ancestors are said to watch the progress of the lives of their descendants. 1,000 years ago, when it took many months to cross continents and oceans, mystics claimed that spirits could travel around the world in seconds. Now we can send our thoughts in texts that reach the other side of our planet in seconds. Psychics talked about the power of remote viewing long before video, but now we can live stream as events anywhere in the world happen. We can fly across oceans and continents. All the powers said to be ours in the unobstructed, we seem to replicate as best we can. Our scientists strive to transfer consciousness and identity to cyborgs or somewhere out into the digital cloud. We're working on immortality in our laboratories, imitating the unobstructed life Betty and the Invisibles explained in more detail in the book Across the Unknown. The Betty book is playful, abrupt, its appendix tedious in its detail. Across the Unknown, in comparison, resembles Stream of Consciousness. Most of part 1 is a rambling rehash that leaves readers wondering. Perhaps the writing suffered due to co-author Harwood, Stewart's younger brother, an astrologer and tennis coach well known in the wealthy community of Montecito, California. Or perhaps Stewart explained it. Quote, consequently, when the translation slowed down or the intake seemed blocked, or we otherwise encountered what the records term, quote, difficulty, unquote, we followed the natural impulse to redouble the pressure and work twice as often and twice as long. As a result, things always went from bad to worse until finally Betty went on a temporary strike and refused to do anything more at all, unquote. Happily, the book takes flight after page 77. certain words must receive clearer definitions. The first is imagination. Betty didn't think much of the word, but the Invisibles held it in high esteem, as we see in this exchange. Quote, I don't think, Betty interjected, quote, that's a very good word, imagination. It's too cobwebby with unrealities, unquote. The Invisibles responded, imagination? Why, that is the very gateway to reality. Imagination is the power of transportation that overrides space and time. Imagination enables you to put yourself anywhere. It's the power of juxtaposition that puts together things that were never put together before, at points of contact that nobody else ever thought of. It's the power to see the pattern with a capital P, unquote. Another word that needs a new definition is spiritual. The Invisibles want us to take away any, quote, ecclesiastical, unquote, associations. It should stand for, quote, spontaneous enjoyment, legitimate heart indulgence, unquote. That way, the word can have, quote, rough and ready hiking clothes, unquote, instead of priestly robes. The Invisibles also had a word to say about how living humans think of our dead, even when we believe in life after death. Quote, when you think of us, don't bother about our shape or substance. It is a living and loving form. Still, nothing unnatural or vaporous. Don't make such an unattractive picture of the change. Keep us in your hearts as we were. It is nearer the truth and more comforting than trying to comprehend the difference. The more naturally you can think about us, the less apt you are to go astray on phantasms of your own conception, unquote. Betty laments this love that visualizes those who return to the unobstructed as mere images. For those who believe that, how can eternal, quote, warmth and response, unquote, exist? Betty testified, they're so real, and so much more vibrant, unquote. What you can take with you. While we're shedding Neanderthal superstitions, such as aging, Stewart suggested let's give up the fear that death is some kind of hard line, or dispersal, or ultimate absence of existence and consciousness. The Invisibles explained, quote, we keep right on just as we've been going. You shut up the old house and move into a new habitation that is closer to your work. That is death, unquote. They added, quote, get over any idea that death is going instantaneously to transfigure you into celestial beings. You did not leap to maturity when you graduated from high school into college. There is no sudden jump which will transform you. You take over what you are. That is the real continuity. It's not the continuity of going over to something easier and adapted to all your peculiarities. It is a smooth transition, unquote. We're like experienced sailors who suddenly find ourselves in charge of an airplane. Stewart wrote, quote, to be sure the skills of sheet and halyard, reef and spinnaker, tack and reach are useless. But the qualities we have developed in acquiring those skills come in very handy. Alertness, coolness, judgment, prompt muscular reaction, resourcefulness, courage, caution. We learned about them on the water. We can use them in the air. The Invisibles added that we, quote, set up housekeeping with a few things you had brought along of reality, unquote. Hopefully, we have brought with us some familiarity with willpower. We've learned patience. We know how to persevere. Somewhere in our lives, we've experienced giving and receiving, quote, loving kindness, unquote. With these, quote, enduring qualities, unquote, we can create a new environment. They suggest that we think of death this way. Imagine finding yourself in a country where you don't speak the language and you have no luggage. Your survival and your success depends on what you've learned during your earthly sojourn. If we are honest, humble, heartfelt, and eager to learn, we will find the adjustment easier. As we have seen in the after-death state of the Tibetan bardo, our own fears generate beings we mistake for cosmic enemies, thus losing our brief chance for enlightenment and for liberation from the karmic wheel. If we expect to see hell, then hell we see. But the invisibles tell us it's not punishment we should fear in the afterlife, but the consequences of wasted opportunities. Betty gave a description of the process in the following poetic passage, quote, "Today I'm playing such a curious, beautiful game. I'm putting together precious bits of memory perfections. Such a curious jumble of things, memories of wide, awesome spaces, and mountain tops, and flowing deserts, and young spring, and fragrances, and rosy babies, all the releasing memories I have on hand," unquote. As we have seen, the Invisibles taught that memories of deeply cherished experiences are the first step in meditation and prayer. They become our, quote, building materials, unquote, in the unobstructed. Betty continues, "I am learning how I shall use my earth experiences over here, the creative power of them when put together properly. They are building materials, just as brick and mortar are there. I pile up my memories and step on them, as it were, into a higher condition of perception," unquote. What follows is a poignant confession by a woman who lived a life of yachts, mansions, safaris, and wilderness hikes, and who knew the kind of love from which legends are made. Quote, "My precious sensibilities, I haven't half enough of them. I hunt around among my deepest and tenderest feelings, my intensest longings, all the parts of me that are most quivered with life. I wish there were a lot more. They make such a little bit of building material. It would be terrible to come over without any intensities to build on. I feel the difference just as you can tell electric current or when it's shut off. Just as definite as that. This current is the intensity that runs through to our pleasures and beliefs and longings, the permeation of the spirit, which is so difficult to put into convincing words," unquote. Occultists, psychics, and traditionalists. Stewart recognizes three basic paths of spirituality. He warned that the occult, including use of drugs for spiritual purposes and, quote, yogi exercises, unquote, is a, quote, drastic, unquote, path. The psychic path, he admits, is a catch-all for, quote, everything debatable, from table tipping and automatic writing to trance mediumship. In its purest use, it might be defined as invisible guidance, unquote. Stewart warned that the psychic path can be just as dangerous as the occult path. Quote, "To place oneself indiscriminately at the disposal of unknown forces and personalities is as silly as turning over all your money to someone you know nothing whatever about and whom you've never even seen. There is always the possibility that you will come under wise and considerate care, but the chances are you will wake up one day to find you have attracted a crowd of thugs and incompetents with no desires beyond using you for their own purposes. And that is not all, for even though awakened, you may by then find it next to impossible to free yourself of them." Unquote. Nevertheless, Stewart recognized that the psychic path can be helpful. Quote, "I repeat, some individuals are so constituted that psychic offers the most effective way to begin the journey, possibly the only way for them." Unquote. The third path is, quote, "exoteric religion," unquote. Stewart gives it lukewarm praise and a humorous warning. Quote, "Any religion worthy of the name affords to those especially constituted a means of reaching the higher consciousness, since they deal more in general principle and less in the details of instruction and process. As roots, they are much less dangerous for use by the average man. But for that reason, they are correspondingly less effective, and by no means altogether safe at that. Plenty of people have gone weird over religion, and some have even become violent and had to be locked up. But so can one go crazy over almost anything. I had an aunt who went crazy over cats." Unquote. Yes, Stewart had a crazy cat lady as his aunt. Stewart goes into greater detail concerning psychics and the occult. Spiritualism is its own category. Quote, "That great mass of astonishing and debated phenomena, ectoplasm in all its varied manifestation, clairvoyance, telepathy, direct voice, apport, spiritism, clairaudience, levitation, and such. By most of these have always been regarded, by most of us, these have always been regarded with suspicion or downright disbelief. Nevertheless, such a weight of evidence has accumulated that they can no longer be dismissed by a mere scornful wave of the skeptical hand." Unquote. The occult is a distinct category. Quote, "Occult merely means hidden, the thing beyond what we know, and that is itself the field of our projected exploration. Corresponding roughly to these two aspects of psychics are two general classes of schools, quote unquote. In one, we find literally dozens of systems whose purpose is avowedly the development of, quote, psychic powers," unquote. That means merely a degree of mechanical control over certain faculties latent in all of us, but as yet little understood, unquote. These include, quote, communion with the dead, visions of the future, the obtaining of material benefits, and the like, unquote. The first category involves testing the limits of reality, from invoking dramatic demonstrations to experimenting with extrasensory perception. The second category intends to transform a narrow-minded human being into a co-creator with nature. Stewart's advice is the same for all three spiritual paths. Reject urgency. Avoid isolation. Stay grounded. Be joyous. Which brings us to the subject of sex after death. Stewart asked the question everyone has wondered about at one time or another. Quote, "Between those thus mated, is there any form of what might be called private relationship? That is, a relationship peculiar to them as individuals, corresponding, however vaguely, to our physical relationships?" Unquote. The Invisibles responded, "Your world is full of the ecstasy of harmonious attraction. beginning at the mere chemical affinities and proceeding upward to the sex relations. This same magnetic attraction continues, but in vastly higher and even more ecstatic form. It takes place eventually through perfect union of complementary spiritual halves, unquote. Plato's idea. The Invisibles explain, quote, "It is a little difficult to put concisely, as there are many ramifications and half-realized conditions before the perfect mating takes place." That is not very satisfactory as an explanation, but you may rest assured that the beauty of physical mating is not lost, but intensively increased in the spiritual realm, unquote. Betty added, quote, "I consider it undoubtedly possible for the truly mated to continue together. In fact, I think it's impossible for them not to do so," unquote. But Stewart dug deeper, quote, "Mated relations here have two phases or angles, the fairly uniform affectional relation and the occasional intensified relation. Do both exist there in any form?" Unquote. The Invisibles responded. Discouragingly complex subject, because all affection is infinitely varied in all stages of acquisition. We cannot take you into conditions beyond your human imagination. We can only vaguely satisfy with what will be your next step. It is rather more crescendo than spasmodic. After this disclaimer, an enigmatic description followed. Quote, "Just as on earth you rise to certain heights by occasional bliss, so here by harmony you obtain these heights. Perhaps occasionally you have them dimmed by periods of distraction, but the heights are always there and obtainable and extendable. In time, you can grow permanently into your highest ideal and remain there, the while you occasionally scale even greater heights. This is progressive bliss, intensified as you grow into greater capabilities of realization," unquote. That was still not enough for Stewart. Quote, "All of which is a property of the two mated, of opposite sex, as opposed to being a common relation of all spirits," unquote. Why did Stewart specify opposite sex? By doing so, he emphasized that he was talking about the only legal form of sexual intercourse at that time between husband and wife. The Invisibles responded, quote, "But with your present earth ideas and desires, you cannot fully appreciate how change of structure will influence your ideas. Don't you see? We're trying to tell you that we do have something private between just the two, but change of structure and wider vision change your desire for so intensely personal an attitude. It is absolutely possible. Only as the child cannot comprehend the grown-up ideal, so you cannot now put your earth desires as a standard for what you will desire when you get here." The Swedish scientist and visionary mystic Swedenborg wrote that perfected love between husband and wife unites them in the afterlife as an angel. But he does not tell us if an angel took form as husband and wife. If so, since husband and wife during their lives do not recall that they are two parts of a single angel, has the angel forgotten being an angel? Or is a new angel born from the fusion of two human souls? Swedenborg did not specify. Perhaps free of the prejudices of the past, this angelic birthing can be understood as the ultimate attainment of not just married couples, but of all souls who achieve the true potential of love. The secret of success. How to have success has always been a popular topic. For early Christians, success did not include wealth and social status because such things were snares, illusions meant to occupy our minds until we died unredeemed and ended up in hell. For many modern Americans with esoteric interests, but also for those who follow the various sorts of prosperity gospels, success is attained by visualizing correctly, ritualizing accurately, and thinking positively. The Invisibles put a different spin on the subject. Quote, the point toward which all this instruction trends is ultimate identification with your higher self. But first must come a vital effort to know that higher self and a gradual training of your spiritual muscles to maintain it once recognized. The Invisibles considered the true definition of success to be the attainment of enlightenment. They explained, quote, this does not mean that you should cease to interest yourselves in the multitude of activities all around you, people and books and experiences. These are hourly food. But it does mean most emphatically that your major efforts should be in the recognition and cultivation and establishment of your inner being, the eternal part of you. The gradual growth and expansion of this eternal self is the major business of each day, whatever may be the pressure of obligations in your everyday life, end quote. Success is not the result of ritual, prayer, ruthlessness, or the other well-worn human reflexes involving using the will to manifest what we want. According to the Invisibles, what makes for success is not only seriousness, which has its place, but playfulness is equally important. The Invisibles warn us that it may be rough going at first from the perspective of conventional success. Quote, the development of the higher perceptions brings to you sympathy and understanding and compassion, but also at first a somewhat amateurish handling of life. The only way to strengthen and be comfortable and assured in these higher faculties is secretly to romp in them, humorously to perceive that you are rather flat-footed in them, unquote. This inspires the Invisibles to suggest a simple exercise. Quote, for example, however absurd in some aspects this may appear, however unaccustomed and ridiculous, try momentarily to enter the sensation. Recall the childhood memories of progressing light-footedly, the skipping just above that gravitation weight which comes later in life, unquote. Betty added, quote, I see a drab-colored duty person, wearisomely doing good, doing right. And then there's a cheerful, comfortable, selfish person doing things enthusiastically that don't do anybody much good. He has a vital spark. The other hasn't. That is the reason the selfish person appears to get on so well. It's more important than we realize, this ingredient of eagerness, unquote. Nuisances and fanatics. The newly enlightened promoting urgent revelations have always been with us. The few went on to head enormous organizations. Quote, there is a fashion element here, unquote, Stewart explained, quote, which is a good safeguard. Social usages are quite right in forbidding our boring each other with heavy topics or indecent exposure of one's inner life. The first rule should be never to go around indecently, sloppily baring your innermost self to people, unquote. Stewart and Betty never started an organization to teach about the unobstructed universe. They had no guidebooks or exercises except the few shared in the series of books that chronicle their great experiment. They believed they had provided all the inspiration they could, and that each human being must ultimately find his or her own way. leaders and organizations that look upon their peers with the zeal of missionaries had a mission, all right, but it often had more to do with their own wealth and power than the true course of the soul. Stewart further elaborated, quote, "In dealing with the higher consciousness, the time comes when we feel the urge to pass it on to others. We have discovered what to us is new country. We have gained possession of something fresh and exciting. We are convinced of its value. We are wildly enthusiastic about it. Our natural impulse, then, is to share it with our friends. It is more than an impulse, more than a desire. It is an obligation, a serious obligation, a solemn duty to do good in the world. Let's set about it at once." Unquote. This initial missionary zeal is so common not only in those pursuing esoteric knowledge, but also among enthusiasts of traditional religions that we can perhaps call it a rite of passage. Stewart describes the predicament well. Quote, "That is how bores and nuisances, zealots, fanatical reformers come into being. Those are not pleasant or welcome persons. Even when they are right, they are wrong, for their very overenthusiastic persistence fills the average man with a perverse desire to go the other way. I suppose this is one of the most perilous spots of country one has to cross in his excursion toward the unknown." Unquote. How the dead communicate with the living. After she crossed to the unobstructed, Stewart wrote down that he had learned about Betty's new life, addressing her, but also all of us. Quote, "You are able to see and touch our world. You experience the same reactions subjectively as you would through your physical senses. However, you add something to what you have perceived in the flesh. You, quote, see also beyond it," unquote. "You understand us when we speak aloud to you. I gather that an unspoken message consciously addressed to you is likewise heard," unquote. This intimate communication with our loved ones who have gone on is reminiscent of the ancestor worship found in the early cultures of all races. Stewart's description continues, quote, "I understand that you do not read thoughts not addressed to you, but also you could do so if necessary or desirable. The, quote, density, unquote, so much talked about as being between your world and our world is a density affecting our receiving function. Its penetration by you is a job, but the idea that it is dulling to you, that it hampers you as a drug might, is incorrect," unquote. Quote, "We do creative things here," unquote, Betty explained. Quote, "There is not much original genius on your side. Sometimes there is, but more often what you call genius is a dipping into what individuals here accomplish. Great artists have dexterity, and as a rule, they are also great psychics. Sometimes they get our thought without being able to produce it, and that is a real tragedy. Scientists work on what you call scientific discovery and are subject to sudden solutions of their problems, as in sleep," unquote. "It is easier for those in the unobstructed to reach us in the obstructed when we are asleep," Betty explained. "Sometimes, quote, sometimes, just as in this communication, I use the released subconscious of this station and its storehouse to produce my message. So in your sleep, to an extent, is your subconscious released. And sometimes the impingement of our ideas is actuated in the same fashion in sleep by the stirring of a subconscious memory," unquote. Betty describes the possibility of a world in which we can turn to the unobstructed for guidance and inspiration. To help us achieve such a goal personally, she offers a technique for understanding dreams. Quote, "Frequently dreams, stripped of their emotional content, are a direct contact with the unobstructed universe and with an idea being promulgated there. With this knowledge, you could become mentally adept at using your dreams and solving your problems during sleep. And do not think for one moment that high, low, and in between do not at times tap the infinity of our thought, unquote. Betty didn't specify what she meant by, quote, high, low, and in between, end quote. She may have simply been reminding us that our thoughts span the spectrum naturally. Or perhaps she meant that there are all sorts of invisibles, like there are all kinds of incarnate human beings. Here we are in the territory of shamans and exorcists, with the theaters of our individual minds subject to the observation, but perhaps also the manipulation of spirits. Stewart added, every writer worth his salt is familiar with the fact that he, as a deliberately planning person, has but a minor part in his work. Most of it, and the best of it, is done instinctively, subconsciously, with inspiration, the choice of the word depending upon his bias of belief. So well publicized is this phenomenon as to writers that there is small utility in laboring the point here, but that it obtains as to all other men in all other callings is not so well acknowledged. Nevertheless, that is the way all the worthwhile forward-moving work of the world is accomplished. And pinned down to honesty, any businessman, professional man, statesman will admit it. Quote, follow your hunch, unquote, as a phrase has become part of the language. And as practical advice, it needs little addition. Quote, welcome your hunch and examine it, unquote, perhaps. Then 9 times in 10, you will follow it, unquote. The invisibles confirm the existence of a door to the unobstructed that is always open in our minds, whether we are aware of it or not. Quote, very often, even the ordinary thoughts you have are not strictly, quote, your own, unquote. For instance, you'll have what you think are random thoughts. Where do you suppose they come from? It's funny to spend half a day yelling in a fellow's ears and then hear him say, quote, I just had a nice little funny thought, unquote. Later, the invisible explains that introduction of precise thoughts into an incarnate mind is rare. Perspective, the stream of until now unseen possibilities, describes it a little better, unquote. Betty describes the importance of light from the view of the unobstructed itself and in the way the invisibles perceive our obstructed world. Quote, they're showing me a very advanced method of reaching us. A special kind of adjustment is involved, the sort of thing the specialists over here use to look at us. It shows our world very dark. Here and there are spots of glow or phosphorescence from the more developed among us. The glow comes not so much from any light of our own as from the decay or passing off of the lower parts of us, the undeveloped parts. Betty, unquote. Betty described how unobstructed beings can perceive and help those sojourning in the obstructed. We must remember her warning that these descriptions are more metaphors than accurate facts. Quote, now I'm taking the point of view of a very highly developed person on this side, one of the really great radiant ones. If I were such a one and wanted to help someone with the phosphorescent glow in the darkness, how would I go about it? Why, I think I would just come close and contemplate him, and so bring the effect of my radiation on him, unquote. What effect would this immersion in light have? Betty explained, quote, first of all, it would burn away or melt away the external dull crust, exposing the core of his reality. And that core would then reflect the light of my radiation, thus becoming visible to the man. It would not glow of itself, but it could now reflect light from me, and that would show that man to himself, make himself visible to him. Do you see? It was all dark to him before, but now he can see himself because of this reflected light and can perceive his needs and lacks and all that. And then while the glow is on him, and only then, he can write to himself about it or talk to himself about it in detail, just what he needs. But all I have done is to bring my radiation to him, unquote. Unfortunate word, radiation. Keep in mind that when Across the Unknown was written, no one knew that in a few short years, nuclear bombs would be detonated over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The emanation of an energetic field, the radiance of the purified soul, the spark of consciousness are possible synonyms. A new way to avoid the vortex. As we have seen in the Betty book, we are told about the vortex, that downward spiral so much of society seems to perpetuate. However, the Invisibles tell us that we can learn to, quote, take for granted the usual resistances and obstacles, unquote. And these may include, quote, difficult and destructive personalities, unquote. Quote, in the past, we've instructed you only as to the negative aspect, the retirement to your inner fortress, and it still holds good, but only to point the way to that other insulation which makes of yourself a sphere of influence stronger than the ones around you. That is a positive insulation, one in which you take the initiative, not a withdrawal, unquote. Quote, I'm beginning to understand it now, Betty responded. Quote, it looks something like keeping a natural, healthy manner in a sick room. You must maintain vigor in each directed thought. The Invisibles explained. Quote, the waterfall sweeps clean the mind, contemplating it. Its refreshing misty spray claims the beholder in a temporary waterfall companionship. Likewise, the sun expands and evaporates the contractions and isolations of the body. In just this way, the power of the higher consciousness extends its influence. It controls by blanketing the opposition with its own quality, unquote. When we have spiritual contact, we can not only resist the vortex, we can help others resist it too. The vortex seems almost invincible when we struggle against it, but the Invisibles explained why spiritual contact is stronger. Quote, you see, one of the most fundamental things about all the obstructive refuse you have to contend with is that it has released its relationship with the ultimate source of life and is cooling off and dying of decomposition. Once you realize and understand this thoroughly, you will never be tempted to lose hope and give in, unquote. The paradoxes and ironies of our world are not to be forgotten. When judging ourselves and others, we should understand how inappropriate perfectionism is in our imperfect world. Ultimately, it has to do with how we treat others, as the Invisibles explained. Quote, Rule 1 is always to accept your material's limitations and imperfections, especially in human beings. Never waste time on their faults. A fault commented on with coldness, even if the element of irritation is controlled, is but chilled and set and deprived of the warm, life-giving quality which would make it susceptible to being overcome and transmuted. Your attention on it is of no help. It merely increases the disjunction of the consciousness you are trying to integrate, unquote. Bouts with perfectionism are not uncommon on the spiritual path. We may even mean well when we continually correct people we love. We may believe we are helping them become more spiritual, but we are not. If we wish to help them, we do so by becoming good examples. The goal is not the development of psychic powers. Some may find these along the path, but they are the least of the gifts of spiritual awareness. Stewart explained, quote, a method of life, That is what we are here to learn. That in the process, we do make acquisition of ease and serenity and health, that we do gain new insight, new comfort and happiness, and even incidentally, certain definite new powers we can accept thankfully. But ordinarily, these should be automatically accompanying rewards, not ends in themselves, unquote. In short, when confronting the vortex that surrounds us, we benefit by continually asking ourselves, which spring will we drink from? The polluted waters of the vortex, tainted with the fear, anger, and anxiety of confused souls who have forgotten what they are, or the pure water of the spiritual spring within. That is the end of part 8 of the Unobstructed Way. Part 9, we'll be looking at time and space, life, consciousness, and creation, and an answer to the question, what is matter? And then some last words, as part 10 will consist of our 2 appendixes, showing the striking similarities between Plato's theories and the Unobstructed Way, and also the secret of the golden flower and the Unobstructed Way. Tamra and I hope that you enjoyed this and find it inspiring. If so, please give us a thumbs up or subscribe or comment so that we know that you are wanting to have more. Thanks for joining us and taking some time to hear about the unobstructed universe.